Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, welcome and thank you for joining our webinar today. I think we'll make a start now. So essentially this webinar today will be about just give an update on the regulatory environment in Australia. For those of you who are quite new to the Australian market or basically to TGA, this will be a high-level guidance and overview as to what the requirements are. And for those who are actually quite familiar, it's really intended to be a refresher. So I hope to really cover the key points in this webinar. Before I start with anything, I'll go through our routine housekeeping rules. So you should all see a screen similar to this. And if you press on that orange arrow, you'll see a box which prompts you to ask any questions. So throughout the webinar, if you do have any questions that come to your mind, please enter them in that box and we'll collect that from our end. If I don't get a chance to get to your question at the end of this webinar, we will follow that up with you offline via email. So please do enter your questions there if you do have any. And before I start with going into the topic, for those of you who haven't heard of us before or want a bit of confidence as to why we should present this type of webinar, I'll go through our background to our company. So we are Brandwood Biomedical. We focus on medical device and IVDs. We're a regulatory consultancy. We do have offices in Sydney, in Wellington, Beijing and Hong Kong. But as you can see in the map, we do have a focus in the Asia Pacific region. We do think we are highly networked and we're highly engaged with regulatory agencies and bodies. In saying that, we do come from a global perspective. So what that means is there's always this shift towards global harmonization from various regulatory agencies around the world. And it's really important to keep that working relationship so we keep on top of things, and that's how we help medical device manufacturers gain supply, market supply to the Asia Pacific. If you do have any further questions, there's our website over there. And now I'll go into the agenda. So in today's webinar, as I mentioned, it is intended to be a really high-level overview. I'll start off with just talking about the Australian market, and for those who are thinking of why they should enter, what are some of the key things or key potentials of the Australian market. Second thing will be just refresher, so going through the TGA process. Again, a very simple overview as to how you can gain approval and market access. I'll also be talking about clinical evidence, and if you follow our newsletters, you'll notice it's an ongoing topic. It's a hot topic in the past couple of months, so I'll speak a bit more about that in this session. I'll also be talking about custom-made devices, and this is also a recent, I guess, notification protocol or a recent tool that's been introduced. We've also sent that out as a blog, but I'll go through that with you in this webinar. And lastly, just some upcoming reforms. What are some of the changes that are upcoming or are being discussed, and what can you expect in future? Okay, so the Australian market, in a nutshell and in a brief sentence, it's really characteristic of a market that's growing, but it's driven by the demographics. What that means is over the past half a century, the actual population is growing quite steadily. However, the life expectancy is growing at a faster rate, and what that means is we're going towards a more aging population. And when you've got an aging population, then you'll need to meet more health needs, and therefore there's more opportunities for the medtech market to serve this aging population. This graph here shows just that steady growth. So we are seeing that population growth from a few decades with a life expectancy at birth of 82.2 years. So there is a lot of potential for more medical devices to serve the health needs, and just because of this aging population that we're seeing in Australia. And this is also reflected in the health spending. So also driven by the Australia's universal healthcare, we are seeing health spending from both government and private sectors, and you can see that increasing trend from that graph over here. We do have also things like subsidized pharmaceuticals and doctors' consultations, and they do drive up that government health spending. That's just a bit of information for you there. Also, so just press next. Okay, there you go. Now, but without going into detail about the other sort of statistics, some key characteristics of the medtech market. I know the statistics here from 2013, but within that time, the turnover for the medical device industry was almost $12 billion. There was about $6 billion imported with $2 billion exported, and you'll see there's a 1 million devices still registered, and it's over 500 companies. So a bit of statistics there that really characterize that Australian medtech market. Now, so once you decide you want to gain market access into Australia, the next session is really about what are the kind of processes you need to take, and basically what you'd need to go through before you'll be able to gain market access. And this is where I'll introduce some of the TGA and regulations. A TGA on its own, in brief, can be described as a small agency that is seeking to leverage international harmonization. So later on through the webinar, we'll be talking about some of the reforms and some of the changes that are being discussed. And from there, you'll see that there is this effort towards harmonization with other international regulatory agencies. For your interest, this is actually where TGA is. So it's in ACT. It's a large building, and I guess some of the fun facts of TGA is that it was once a laboratory building, so it's got a strong scientific culture to it. In terms of the device section, they are quite limited in resources, so we do have less than 100 employees in devices, and that could affect some of the timelines and application processes, which we'll get to later. But that's essentially the building there. Now, the actual regulatory model. So the regulations in Australia align very closely with Europe. The key characteristics of the European model, if you're familiar with them, you notice they're characterized by the essential requirements, having standards as a means of compliance. It's based on a rule-based risk classification. So, and obviously the lower the class, the lower the regulatory intervention, and the higher the class, if you've got class 3, there's more assessment and more regulatory intervention. And there is a post-market vigilance system, so even though you've got an approval, it doesn't really stop there. The agency actively monitors the post-market. You do have to consider the performance and safety of a product once it's gone to the market. Now, if you compare that to Australia, apart from the flag that's changed, the essential requirements is really essential principles, and they are similar with some local differences, which I won't get into detail in this session, but essentially the key characteristics are the same. In Australia, you still have to have standards as a means of compliance. It's a rule-based risk classification, so classifications range from class 1 to 3, and the lower the class, the lower the regulatory intervention. The higher the class, obviously more regulatory assessment, more intervention required. And also, TGA does have a post-market vigilance system, so actively monitors the devices post-market to make sure that even post-approval, they still do meet safety and performance requirements. That's essentially a regulatory model there. This is the Therapeutic Goods Act, so it's the legislative instrument that defines and talks through the requirements for medical device and market entry requirements. I won't go through this in detail. There's a link there. It's really for your bedtime reading, but I just wanted to draw out on the section or chapter 4, which focuses on medical devices. So that's where you can look into for details of what is required and what's sort of defined in the Act. And that section there is about the conformity assessment procedures, which we'll get to later on in the webinar. But there's that link there if you want to refer to it. You've then got the therapeutic goods regulations, which really administers the Act, and you'll see that the key characteristics I mentioned there about essential principles and conformity assessment and all of these kind of things I'll talk about in detail, but again, that's also something you can refer to for more detail later on. It's there for your reference. And also again for your reference is just a way to compare the similarities between European and Australian requirements. So as you know, for example, if you've got a class 3 device in Europe, you'll need to have the certificate for Annex 2, so full quality assurance, including Annex 2.4, which is examination of design. In Australia, that corresponds with Part 1, which is the full quality assurance procedures and an examination of design. And similar with the other annexes as well, you've got the corresponding parts in Australia. So there are the similarities between the European directives and the Australian regulations. Now, past all the legislative instruments and the acts, before I get into what the process is for supplying device in Australia, I wanted to go through some categories of devices that don't necessarily have to go through TGA and there's no assessment of safety involved. The first category is devices that are used for clinical trials. So this will include things like clinical trial exemptions, one pathway. So any products that are used for clinical trials don't need to go through TGA assessment of safety. There are two main pathways to go through clinical trials. First one is called the CTX, and as it's mentioned in there, it involves a direct assessment of the clinical trial protocol by TGA. Because of that, there are high fees, and it does take a bit of time, and it tends to be used mainly for the high-risk medicines. And if you go through this pathway, you would maximize your likelihood of getting a subsequent approval, but again, there is that high fee and the timelines to consider. And in this pathway, TGA is basically engaged with the whole development process. The second pathway is called the clinical trial notification pathway. So in this case, you've got an ethics committee that needs to assess your protocol, and they have oversight of the trial. TGA may audit the trial, but they don't have that heavy involvement as the previous pathway. It requires a notification only, and everything is give and take. So in this case, you might pay lower than the other ones, but the chances of you to get a pre-approval are not as high as a CTX. Most manufacturers tend to go through this way, and yeah, from our knowledge, all devices have been done through this way to date. And that's just the one category. So devices used for clinical trials do not need TGA assessment of safety. The second category of devices or products that don't need TGA assessment are those who can go through special access. So typically this is a case if you've got patients who are really critically ill, so life and death, and there are some provisions to getting them access to treatments. And as mentioned, there's generally humanitarian exemptions or advanced access pending approval later on. There are three types as mentioned over there. The first one is called Special Access A. This is really an emergency situation, so this will be one of the ones that are more life and death scenario. And in this case, what can happen is a clinician can use an unapproved device, and then they can gain approval for that device later if there's an urgent need to use it for a patient in emergency. The second one is the SASB. So in this pathway, it's not really for immediate emergencies, but for those instances where the patient needs a device, but clinician has to get TGA approval before supplying that to the patient. And the other one is the authorized prescriber. Essentially, the authorized prescriber is a medical practitioner. TGA can authorize a device to be used for a particular patient. And that practitioner essentially becomes responsible for reporting to TGA on the number of patients treated and so on and so forth. And yeah, that's really the second category. And the third category is about personal import. So it is a unique, I guess, provision, but any person can import device or medicine, except if it's a poison, for their own personal use at their own risk. So those three categories, they don't require assessment of safety by TGA. Now, on the other side of the fence, you've got categories of device that must meet safety and performance requirements. First one is the custom-made, and these are, as you know, devices individually manufactured to a clinical prescription or a criteria defined by the clinician, and it's for a named patient. And they're typically things like dental crowns or orthopedic, braces, as mentioned over there. Second category is exempt goods. So there are some products that are very low risk. They're things like the hospital bedding, protective clothing, and conventional toothpaste. And because of their very low risk, they don't necessarily need to go through TGA, but they must still meet safety and performance requirements. And as I've highlighted over there, these two categories, they don't need to be assessed. There's no formal application for them. However, they're exempt for ARTG inclusion, but they must have safety and performance requirements applied to them, and they are subject to post-market monitoring. Then you've got the third, which is, I guess, what most of you will be interested in, and that's for all others which must be included on the ARTG before they can be supplied to the market. So these include your Class 1 to Class 3 or active implantable internal device, and also Class 1, Class 4 IBDs. And as mentioned there, these devices are subject to TGA regulatory assessment, and the higher the classification, the higher the assessment and the intervention will be from TGA. Okay, so now for those that need to go onto the ARTG, The key points to keep in mind is that first point is they must be included on that ARTG before they can be legally supplied, unless of course it's under the exempted category or it's a custom made or it doesn't need to be. But that's really the primary point of control, that Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, that ARTG. And the key thing here is when you try and supply a product, they can be actually grouped into one ARTG certificate. That's the second point in there. So devices can be shared, can be grouped as kinds of devices if they share certain characteristics, as listed over there. If there's any devices that have same manufacturer, if they have the same sponsor, GMDN code, classification, or intended purpose, then they can be classified as the same kind, and you can have one ARTG certificate that covers multiple devices. A note on the intended purpose, it's not specifically called out in the regulations. However, for devices that would have the same GMDN and classification, you would allude to the same intended purpose, even though it's not explicitly called out. But the key message there is if they share those kind of characteristics, they can be included on the ARTG under one certificate. There is an additional requirement for Class 3 devices, so they must also have a unique product identifier. And as I said, for those of you who are new and not sure how to register, this could be one starting point, grouping your products according to these categories to identify which can be same kind of devices. Now, early on in the presentation, I mentioned that the regulations in Australia closely align with that of Europe, and because of that, there is a fast-track option for some manufacturers of devices. If you have an EC certificate, you can use that to go straight to your ARTG application without going through TGA conformity assessment. And this is applicable to most devices, and there are some exclusions, but for most devices, once you have your approval in Europe, you can use that as your gateway and your fast track to register your product in Australia. And I'll go through a bit more detail on the next slide. So this is really still high level, but it's intended to be step-by-step as to how you can register. You've really got three key parties involved. The first one is the legal manufacturer, and the legal manufacturer will have all the documentation, the CE certification, technical file data. They would need to determine the classification in Australia, and they'd also need to have an Australian declaration of conformity. This is assuming that a device can go through CE certification. Now, you also must have an Australian sponsor, and this must be a legal entity locally based in Australia, and they will be responsible for holding the licenses, legally responsible for holding licenses. Basically, then you want to register your product. The manufacturer first submits the CE certification to the sponsor, and the sponsor would then submit this to TGA. Now, the E is an online electronic portal. It's the business services portal. The sponsor submits that to TGA, and that gets assessed. So, for example, if it's a Class 2B and manufacturer gives them a Annex 2.3 certificate for full quality assurance, TGA will assess that, and if that's accepted, they'll accept the manufacturer's evidence. So that will be considered as the manufacturer's evidence. Once that's done, the sponsor can then make the ARTG application for inclusion of that device using that manufacturer's evidence. And then again, that's lodged through online. It gets assessed by TGA, and if there are no questions and everything looks all good, then we get the ARTG entry, and the sponsor can now legally supply the device in Australia. Now, there are certain cases where some devices will need to go through an application audit. What this will involve is review of the manufacturer's technical file data as well as the Australian Declaration of Conformity. Especially the case for Class 3 devices, they are subject to a mandatory application audit, and there are certain documents that are required, such as your clinical evidence and your risk assessment. But for all others, it's not a mandatory audit, but there is a chance you could be selected for a desktop audit, and the technical file data will be reviewed. So yes, this is the category of devices that would be subject to a mandatory application audit. I guess the obvious ones are just the active implantable, and all Class 3 devices are subject to the mandatory audit. And you've also got things like self-testing or point-of-care IVDs and devices that are for disinfection of other devices. And that's really there for your reference, but there are some categories of devices that would need to go mandatory application audits. So what's involved in the audit? There are two levels of audits. That when I refer to the mandatory application, I'm referring to the level 2 audit there. But level 1 is things like review of the declaration of conformity, making sure your CE certificate or your conformity assessment certificate is valid, and also reviewing your labels, your IFU, brochures, advertising, making sure sponsor labels are correctly placed on the device, and things like that. Then when you go through your class 3 devices, which need to go through level 2, then TGA will want to review your risk assessment as well as your clinical evidence, and for the case of disinfectors and sterilizers, performance evidence. That's just there for your reference. Now, in terms of processing times, we have seen from experience they're much faster. Well, obviously the CE certificate pathway is much faster than TGA conformity assessment certificate. In terms of applications, we have experience that can be as low as 1 week turnaround time. If you've got, however, dealing with class 3s and application audits, then you could be looking at something like 6 months. And this is a really variable nature of the timeline, depending on the quality of the documentation, as well as the resources, as I mentioned earlier. For your reference also is just a table of fees. There's a link there if you want to look into detail, but for class 1 to 3, it's all tabulated there. As you can see, there's no application fee for class 1, but every device is subject to an annual TGA fee, which is all tabulated there. And there's also fees there for your reference on the application audits. As well, we've got the conversion rate, and I think they should be current to now, if you wanted to have a look at that for your marketing purposes. And I mentioned before, so there's some devices that cannot go through CE certificate. It is a fast track for most devices. If you've got approval in Europe, you can jump straight to the device application and present that to TGA. However, there are certain class of devices that can only go through direct TGA conformity assessment, and you won't be able to use any other certificate in lieu of the TGA certificate. And these are classes that are class 3 with integral medicine, any medicinal component that's included in the device, or class 3 with biological component. So these will be the recombinant products, blood products, and things that are of microbial origin and things like that. So there's two broad categories of devices which must go through TGA conformity assessment. This is now for your reference, the fees. If you were to go through TGA conformity assessment, the link is there again for your further reference, but if you were to go through TGA conformity assessment, you'll be subject to initial application fee of $9.40, and then depending on the class of your device and which pathway you need to take, there's the fees there, and it should be current as of now. Some manufacturers would also be subject to an audit, so the surveillance inspections, for example, and usually these are determined by TGA at the time. It's really dependent on the application and whether an audit needs to be done, whether it's a change application or if it's a brand new manufacturer and a new process or a new medicinal manufacturing process. All of that is dependent on a case-by-case basis, but standard fees for conformity assessment are tabulated there. And then again, timelines for TGA conformity assessment. We have seen improvements. Assessments normally take about 200 TGA days, or about a year. So if you do want to plan for market entry in Australia, it's always good to keep that in mind, that the actual regulatory process, you should allow about a year and allocate that before you can expect to supply in the market. And then overall summary of the different classifications. If you ignore the diagram for a bit and just focus on the headings, that really captures the key stages to market entry. The first one is really identifying the classification of your device, which class it'll be under. Second one is, based on the classification, what kind of conformity assessment you need to apply. Are you eligible for CE fast track, or do you have to go through TGA if you've got medicine or if it's under that exclusion category? And then after that, you should expect application audits. So whether, depending on the classification, what's the likelihood of going through the mandatory audits? If it's class 3 and some other classes, you'd be expected to have your clinical evidence and risk assessment ready. And for others, you may be subject to non-mandatory audit. And finally, after that, is your ARTG registration. And once you've got the approval for that, that'll be your ARTG certificate and your access to supplying the device in the market. That's just the overall summary. And one thing I should point out is for Class 1s, you'll see there's no conformity assessment or application audit. It's actually self-declaration and ARTG inclusion, so there is no audit involved. You still have to put in an application through the online portal. It's just not assessed. Okay, the next point is on clinical evidence, and apologies for the misspelling there for clinical, but we have seen quite a few discussions around the clinical evidence requirements. So this session I'll just take you through what some of the changes are. In a nutshell and in brief, the key message there is that there's an increased emphasis on the robustness and the documentation of clinical validation. This is not just a case in Australia. We have seen that especially in China and also in Europe. There is this emphasis on clinical evidence requirements. If you're not already aware, there is a new clinical evidence guidance that's published by TGA. It is in draft state still, so the comments are due by 10th of June. It's still really good to have a read through because it's quite detailed, and it clarifies quite a few things and quite a few questions we often get as well. In this talk, I'll just take you through the key parts of that guidance document. It contains really the legislative basis, so it gives you an overview as to what the clinical evidence requirements are or why you need it. And the actual clinical evidence section talks about what sort of data you would need. Now, a lot of people, common question we get is, do we need to have data? Can we use just a clinical evidence report? And it really depends on the device, but the key things there is to look at whether it's new or novel, or whether the indications can be supported by existing data. Some of the key things to consider. And then the clinical evaluation report. So really looking at, firstly, what your device is. Is it novel, or is it based on existing technology which already has clinical data? And then looking at what are the actual indications. Are the indications already have clinical data on other existing products or from your own product, or whether they're completely new indications for which you'll need to present clinical data. And all of these things you need to consider to look at whether you can put in a clinical evidence report in lieu of data, or whether you would need to have additional data support. The other major thing is just presentation of the reports. We have gotten feedback that just a simple presentation and sometimes the poor quality can really make it difficult and make it a more lengthier process. So the guidance talks about format and common errors in clinical evaluation reports, how to present, and substantial equivalence. So there is we noticed that there's a bit of detailed information as to how you can prove substantial equivalence, and we have come across a lot of confusion from manufacturers as to how they may prove that. I know in China, for example, their recent guidance makes it very explicit that it must be on an approved predicate in China, and there are some variations as to how you define that in Europe, for example, essentially looking at predicate similar market devices, but in the context of the key technical biological characteristics and other things that, if there are differences, are they enough to affect the safety and performance in clinical practice? So those are sort of the key headings that are covered in this draft guidance, and they're the key messages that are being discussed at the moment when it comes to clinical evidence. Within this guidance document, there's also more requirements for specific high-risk devices. So you'll find there's more information on total and partial joint prostheses and other things like cardiovascular devices, or half a replacement using prosthetic valve. So the guidance really goes into some specific requirements for these particular class of high-risk devices. And I guess once the draft has been finalized and we can get a clear picture, but this is really the direction that's heading towards with regards to clinical evidence. And if you'd like more information, please do read our blog. We do have, we also have a white paper coming up, but we have talked about this in quite detail in our blog, and really from a practical sense as well, what you can do and what are some of the things you need to consider before you take the approach of a clinical evidence, and considering really whether you do need the clinical data or and how you can present your report. But please do visit our blog to read more, and more updates on this will come, so watch the space. So that's on clinical evidence. The next topic that I'd like to talk is about the custom devices, and it's primarily because there is a new notification pathway that's just been introduced by TGA. Again, if you keep up to date with our blogs, you'll already be aware of this. But firstly, the definition of the custom-made is defined as those that are manufactured on a request by a health professional, which is specific to design characteristic or construction, and it is meant to be intended for a particular patient. There is a misconception for some about what the custom component is. It's not a customized device, which is just simply adjusted or fitted from an existing device. It must be clear on that definition. And up to now, really, the regulation in Australia on custom-made devices was that they're not required to undergo a pre-market assessment, as I pointed out in my earlier slide, and they don't need to actually be included on the ARTG before they can be legally supplied. And the reason for that was really because they were considered to be low risk, and there's really impractical to assess these. They are sort of ordered in the criteria of a physician, and things like prescription glasses and dental crowns are the common custom-made products, and that's why there was the view that it's impractical to really assess it. So up until now, you don't really need to include it on the ARTG. And one of the efforts that we're seeing, not just in Australia but others around the world as well, is this effort towards putting more controls on custom-made devices. For example, these are some of the examples of custom devices, cranial implants, and some might question whether they would fall under a low-risk category. And there is this effort towards making sure there's more controls implemented on these type of custom-made devices so that, end of the day, there's still assurance that they're safe for patients. Again, we do have that block that I was referring to, so TGA is now taking that step to putting tighter controls on the custom-made devices. So we see this as it is a positive move, and at the moment it's just a notification tool that's been established. And I mean, in the regulations, it's always been that you have to notify TGA of the custom devices, but there was no time frames established, and at the moment there's no formal process that's implemented. So this new online notification tool basically requires the sponsors or manufacturers to notify TGA within 2 months of the importation of the custom-made device, and it is that first step to making sure there's appropriate controls on these type of devices. Please refer to our blog for further info, but the link is there as well. And lastly, it's about really what's upcoming, what are some of the reforms, and what are some of the changes that are being discussed. I'll refer to the expert review. So this is an independent review that's conducted of really just the medicines and medical device regulations. And what the review does is it looks at what are the things that are going well in terms of the regulations, what are some of the things that are ineffective and causing a lot of time and effort and costs to manufacturers in the industry, and what are some of the opportunities to improve. And an outcome of this expert review is what we're seeing is there's an attempt to, there's a target to streamline the pre-market to avoid that unnecessary time and cost and effort. And you can do, and the aim is to do that through harmonization with international regulatory bodies. And then after that, you have a stronger post-market. So all the action really happens when devices are supplied in the market, and so the efforts here is trying to streamline that pre-market to make sure people have access to therapeutic goods. And once that's done, then there's a stronger emphasis on post-market to make sure that they are safe and there's no adverse events or anything. So that's the paper there for your reference, is the review of medicines and medical device regulations. And yeah, the stage 1 report was published in June, will be published in June 2015. There are 32 recommendations that are largely based on the points that are listed there. So principles for regulation, they're looking at pre-market approvals, how post-market monitoring is done, how the access to unapproved therapeutic goods work, and really the overall structure. And an overview of some of the recommended changes. The first one is there's no need to change the current system. So at the moment, the system based on classification, the essential principles, and the risk-based assessment is working very well, and there is an assurance that that would make sure that the safety and performance are maintained of devices. And yeah, therefore there's no need to actually to do a drastic change on the system. The second thing is just having a clear rationale for any unique requirements. As we've gone through before, there are some devices that have special requirements for them, and really the recommendation here is to just have a more clear rationale as to what the requirements should be for these type of products. The third one is streamlining or reducing the regulatory intervention for Class 1, and this is because they are very low risk. For example, at the moment, Class 1, as you've seen in the diagram before, don't need conformity assessment. They can, manufacturers can self-declare, and it's auto-inclusion. And even that, though, the recommended approach is to reclassify some of them as consumer goods. These are those type of products that pose little or no risk to consumers, and it would really help TGA's burdensome workload without affecting the health and safety of the population. The third one is really expanding the third-party audits and third-party responsibilities in the conformity assessment procedures. At the moment, the timelines that we showed was around, well, at least 12 months before you can expect the conformity assessment process to be completed, and that's really, again, resource and these kind of things can really put things behind, and the recommendation here is to really expand that third-party responsibility and have the option where a competent third-party body that's designated by TGA will be able to undertake that conformity assessment of the device. So having, this is another effort for harmonization, so having third-party audits and third-party bodies. And again, similar to the previous, utilizing approvals by comparable authorities. At the moment, it's really Europe that's aligned in regulations, and perhaps maybe in future we could have FDA approvals to be recognized. That's a bit of a challenge at the moment because the regulations in US are quite different to Australia and Europe, but there is consideration to accept overseas market approvals, even if it's, again, conformity assessment done through comparable overseas bodies. So the next one, then, TGA to develop the transparent criteria for designation of the third parties. And this is really talking to the previous 2 points. It's a need for the TGA to develop a set of transparent criteria and make sure there's no compromise to safety or performance of the device at the end of the day. And another recommended change is to have expedited pathway for new technologies. And this could be an extension of the current pathways for the non-assessed devices. So earlier in the webinar, we talked about the devices for clinical trials or special access, and this is potentially a way to considering new technologies to be considered as part of an expedited pathway. And lastly, just a stronger post-market, so making use of registries and international sharing of data so that there's a stronger focus on post-market regulation. And a significant outcome of this report was the recommendation that the TGA adopts a regulatory model that allows medical devices to be reviewed and assessed by multiple methods, not just TGA or not just one European notified body, but also, again, international harmonization. And as you can see, it's either assessed by Australian designated third party or by an international third party or a comparable overseas authority such as the FDA, Canada, or Japan. But we'll keep updates on that. And yes, so as mentioned before, so one of the expedited pathways, the recommendation is to have expedited pathways extended to novel technologies, and this could take either in the form of either priority for Australian-based conformity assessment or priority for manufacturer's evidence supplied by overseas conformity assessments. And this will also, one of the challenges in here would be that TGA would need to have better visibility of novel technologies and implantables that are pretty high risk. But yeah, this is another recommendation, so consideration of novel technologies and how their pathway to market can be expedited. And then post-market, so streamlining pre-market and greater emphasis on post-market. That's the recommendation that's been made. And with regards to post-market, it could be in the way of having a database, so data sharing with other registries, and electronic reporting of adverse events, and just better international collaboration and information sharing. And if that were to work, it would really make it easier, not just here, but other regulatory bodies as well, to have better control over the safety of devices and the population and patients. And finally, with these recommendations on board, they would need to, they're also included as points for DC's budget papers. Basically, the costs and administrative burden for the industry will be reduced if we extend the conformity assessment to international bodies. At the moment, for TGA conformity assessments, if it was just to be taken in-house here, the timelines are quite lengthy and there are significant costs associated. If this were to be handed over to some third parties or overseas bodies, then that would reduce the costs. And it's also in consideration for the budget paper. So another point is some low-risk products will be considered for removal from the regulatory scheme altogether, and that's for those really low-risk Class 1 devices that don't pose much risk. Advertising for therapeutic goods will also be simplified, and the number of committees that advise the TGA to be reduced, and these are all some of the considerations that's been made. So in summary, basically Australia continues to be a growing market, and it's primarily driven by demographics. We've got an aging population, which means more need for health services. For TGA uses a harmonized model at the moment based on European directives. So key things from there is the conformity assessment for high-risk devices, but TGA does accept CE certificates for other devices. At the moment, there is an increased emphasis on clinical evidence, not just in Australia, but everywhere else as well. There is a need for a robust, well-documented report. And one thing I didn't mention earlier was in Australia, there's a requirement to have a clinical expert, and that's someone who has to be qualified and has the relevant experience to that device, who'll be able to sign off on the report and concur with the conclusion of the report. There's also a new notification system now for custom-made devices, so please look out for that. Please go to that blog, and there's a link on that notification tool. There's no TGA assessment, but it is a first step where you have to notify TGA 2 months if you're a manufacturer of custom-made devices. And then also upcoming changes and discussions at the moment are focusing on really streamlining the pre-market and shortening the time, effort, and costs associated with the pre-market approvals. The way to do that is to allow multiple paths manufacturers can take for approval, and then focusing stronger, putting the effort on post-market surveillance. And that's really a summary. So that's all for the webinar. I hope you all found it very useful. Thank you for participating. Now, we do have a few minutes, and I'll give you guys a few minutes to put in any other questions you have. As mentioned before, we might not get through all the questions, but we will touch base offline separately via email to answer your questions. So I'll give a few seconds, and I'll go through some of the questions that's been asked. Okay. So one thing I should also point out is we will be sending out copies of this presentation as well as a recording after this, so you will get a copy of the slides. That'll be emailed to you. Now, the first question I've got asked, one of them is, do you need the EC certificate to go through the TGA assessment? Okay, so in this case, if you've got a device that's got a medicine or animal microbial origin or is listed under the exclusion, basically if your device can't use the EC certificate and you must go through TGA, you don't necessarily need the EC certificate to apply to go through TGA, but if you do have that certificate, you can use it to abridge the assessment fees and potentially timelines. His direct answer is no, you don't necessarily need the EC certificate when you're going through the TGA conformity assessment, but it's still helpful to have that if you want to reduce some of the assessment fees that are involved, depending on your case. I've got a question on, can you expand on the sponsorship labeling and what is acceptable and what is not? Yeah, so one of the labeling requirements is that the sponsor, the Australian sponsor name and address, must be displayed on the device itself. If that's not practical to do so, so if you've got an implantable or something, then it could be applied on the actual box or outer box or something that's more practical. You would have to justify it, but the requirement there is that the actual sponsor detail, so the name and address, has to be labelled on every device when you supply it to the market. But yeah, you do have to have the sponsor labeling. There is the regulation of memory, I think it's 10.2, that specifies it. I can follow up through email to send through that specific clause about sponsorship labeling. Next one is the clinical evidence report. Can you have one to supply in Europe, in Australia? Will this be enough? Okay, so this question's it's a good question actually. It's about whether you can have one clinical evidence report and have that to satisfy all regulatory agencies. We have had multiple experience with this. There have been some reports that are of good quality, high standard. They meet the requirements for both Australia and Europe. And there's others who have actually passed Europe, but they haven't been accepted in Australia. And the answer to that is the key elements of a clinical evidence report are the same in terms of first obviously defining the device and finding out if you need to have direct clinical data, having a documented literature search strategy, looking at post-market. But there are some local differences. So the obvious difference is that need for clinical expert in Australia to have it signed off, but the TGA's expectations are higher, I'd have to say. So you have to make sure that your literature search, if you're using that pathway, it is well documented, you have looked at the level of evidence, and you have documented where you have your inclusion-exclusion criteria, for example. And in terms of substantial equivalence, I know that could be a challenge if you want to do that in China versus Australia. As I mentioned before, in China they want something that's approved already, a predicate approved in China, and they want to specifically compare it to that. Whereas in terms of substantial equivalence, you need to compare the obvious things like what are the indications and materials and biological characteristics, the key technical characteristics, what are the intended populations, and if there are any differences, then I need to provide a rationale for why that's not significant in clinical practice. Is that enough to cause additional data, or can that be justified through, say, verification testing or yeah, things like that? But the short answer to that is no. I wouldn't say you can have one. You do need to consider some local differences, even though the MEDEB guidelines are considered here. But please refer to our blog on the clinical evidence for more info, or I can touch base separately. I am getting quite a few questions, so I do apologise in advance if I haven't gone through all. I'll probably go through 2 more questions, and I will touch base separately with others. One of the questions asked was, when will the overseas audits be implemented or changed? So the reforms that I spoke about third party, they're discussions at the moment, and this is where we're heading towards. They're really just things that are upcoming, so I can't say when, or I think it's still in discussions right now anyway. It's in consultation. The idea is that if it works in practice as it does in theory, then hopefully soon, but it's not a question I can answer at this point. And I guess one last question was, how do you report a change, and what's the fees and timelines? So assuming you go through, okay, so assuming you go through a TGA conformity assessment, I have actually got asked this question before, but at the moment there's no black and white guidance as to what would be a significant change for you to notify TGA. If you're going through a TGA conformity assessment, at the moment it's left up to manufacturers to assess the change and determine whether it's significant to warrant notification. So there are some obvious changes that you would need to consider to notify TGA. So anything that changes your certificate details, or if it's a change to the materials, or a significant change to device design. But other than that, it's kind of a hard question to answer as a general one, because it's specific to the product. Essentially, it's an assessment that you'd have to make to see if it's a substantial change, but at the moment there's no clear cut as to what's a change or not. There's a question that's asked, can I ask, an Australia-made medical device has been included on ARTG, sponsored by its manufacturer. Does other Australia sponsor, has the sponsor again on ARTG? Okay, I guess firstly, just to clarify, there's two responsibilities here. So one is actually the legal manufacturer, so that's the manufacturer of the device. Then the sponsor is the Australian sponsor, so legally responsible for the licenses. Now, the manufacturer can also be the sponsor. You don't need to, if you're already based in Australia, or you have a local presence in Australia, you don't need another sponsor to enter on the ARTG. Basically, once that a sponsor has included, then it's on their responsibility, and unless you want to transfer sponsorship to someone else. But no, there's really one sponsor required for one device, if I'm understanding that correctly. I think there's quite a few others. So I think for now I'll close off on the webinar, because we are getting close to the hour. And as I mentioned, I will touch base separately via email to answer any other questions. So thank you once again for watching. I do hope you found the webinar useful, and if you have any other questions that come up after this webinar, please feel free to send us an email. Our details are there. Otherwise, have a great afternoon, and thanks again for watching.